my book review of one of my favorite books. One of the first really deep-going naval or military history books that I read, and that really influenced my thinking about the Second World War and the Pacific War, and especially quite a lot. And so I thought I'd start by giving you a book review about that book that means quite a lot to me. And that book is Kaigun from 1997 by David C. Evans and Mark R. Peattie. The book's full title is Kaigun, Strategy, Tactics and Technology in the Imperial Japanese Navy from 1887 to 1941. It's of course a book about military history, and in particular, just like the title gave away already, about the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy, how it came to be and how it developed up until the eve of the Pacific War in 1941. It was published by the Naval Institute Press in the United States of America in 1997 as a hardcover version, but I do have the softcover version, which was published in 2012. The book is in English, of course, which is why I do my review in English. But I bought it in Germany. I am a German, and here in Germany it cost me some 36 euros, not including shipping. And it's got some 696 pages, of which some 517 are the actual text and the content of the book, and some 144 pages are sources and citations and so on. It is quite a big book, so if you would like to read it on the go, it could be difficult. I read it quite a lot on the train here in Germany going back to Frankfurt, or going to and from Frankfurt, and you can kind of see that it suffered a bit. But I would say it's a big book for a reason, because it got a lot of content, and so that's not a problem for me. So, what's the actual content of this book? Well, as you can see, this is a very big book. There's quite a lot of content, so I'm only going to go over all the content briefly. I'm going to tell you what they tried to do and what they tried to cover, and what they had to leave out because of size constraints. So it's going to take quite a while already, even if I'm just going over it briefly, so please bear with me. By their own mission of the authors, the book is not a complete history of the Imperial Japanese Navy. As we can see from the title, it focuses on strategy, tactics and technology, and the interrelationships of those topics. And I think one quote from the book, from the foreword of the book, illustrates quite nicely what they were trying to do. So, quote, "Finally, as much as anything else, we have attempted to explain how the Japanese Navy thought about naval war and how to prepare for it," end quote. And in my mind, this is great that this book covers this, because I was looking for exactly that when I was looking for a book on the Imperial Japanese Navy, because I had read some other books about the Pacific War, about some key battles, and seen documentaries and so on the internet. And I was thinking, why did they do that? Why did they have the force structure that they had? Why did they have the technology that they had? And why did they lose? Or why did they try to fight this war when it was evidently not a good idea in the end? So that they tried to explore the reasons behind the thinking and that led to that force structure the Japanese Navy had, and the doctrine and tactics strategy. I really liked that about this book, and that is actually the reason why I bought it. One important thing about the content of the book to state in advance is that it doesn't cover the development of the naval aviation aspect of the Imperial Japanese Navy in detail. There's one chapter. It is brief, or shorter than the other chapters and other topics, and that is because they decided to do an extra book on that topic, which is also available, which I also have, so I also have read. It's called Sunburst. I'm going to do a video about that in the future, maybe, and then I'm going to link it here, or I'm going to link it at the end of this video. But you need to be aware of that. If you're more interested in the naval aviation aspect, then maybe you should go for Sunburst directly, or the book Sunburst directly. What's also important to state, talking about the content of this book, is that it doesn't cover the period of the Pacific Wars from 1941 onwards in the same amount of detail that it does cover the developments and what happened to the Imperial Japanese Navy in the period that is advertised in the title, 1887 to 1941. They did this for size constraints, and also later on because there was not much more thinking going on, because at a certain point the Japanese Navy was just beaten, and they didn't have anything to do anymore except maybe some suicide missions. Yes, prudence. So those disclaimers out of the way. Kaigun is structured in 14 chapters. Those chapters reach from the creation of the first modern navy in 1868 onwards through the development of the Japanese Navy, via the first successes in the Chinese in the war against the Chinese, I think in 1895. How they developed that first set of tactics and strategy, the technology they acquired and why they did, how they fought then against the Russians in 1905, what the thinking behind that was, and how that went quite well for them actually. And then there are several chapters after that discussing the further development of the fleet after the Russo-Japanese War, which had a big impact on the Japanese fleet. After the Russo-Japanese War, 7 chapters then deal with the development of the fleet after the Russo-Japanese War, and particularly with the development after the First World War and in the era of the naval treaties in the 1920s and 30s. In those chapters, key topics like the 8-8 fleet plan, the development on strategy and tactics for the next war, the development of the naval air arm, although briefly, as I just said, the struggle of the Japanese marine industry or maritime industry to build ships, or build ships which were needed, the supporting structure behind the battle fleet, and the development of submarine and anti-submarine as well as amphibious warfare are covered. Before then the second to last chapter covers the development of war plans during the last years before 1941, so before the Pacific War, and of course the development of the plans for that war. And then in the last chapter, which in my mind is one of the most interesting, the entire narrative is brought to an end, or is brought together, because then they do an analysis of many of the developments or pre-war developments in light of the experiences of the Pacific War after 1941. So they don't go in great detail there, or in too much great detail. It's a rather short chapter compared to the rest of the book, but they bring together a lot of thinking or thought lines and say, okay, this worked, this didn't work, those were the problems, or those were the problems that they incurred because of this, or because of this thinking strain they had earlier, or because of this or that economical, geographic, whatever constraint. This is very interesting because it answers a lot of questions on the Pacific War that I had, like why did they do this, or why didn't this work, and why did the Americans have successes there, and why did the Japanese have successes in another area. So although this is a rather short chapter compared to the rest of the work, it's actually one of the best. And then after that, after the epilogue last chapter, there's an appendix with the biographies of many prominent naval officers which appear in the book. Each and every one of them has a short paragraph which is quite useful. And after that, there's of course a large number of citations and of sources named, which is also cool if you would like to do some further reading on any of the topics presented in the book. So now for the positive and negative aspects, at least in my opinion, in my humble opinion, of course. It's just what I thought. I don't think that it's universally applicable. What I think is that's right, but I just want to tell you what I think. So for the negative parts of what I thought was a bit negative, of course, it is negative that to me, that the period of the Second World War is largely omitted. So the Russo-Japanese War is covered in detail, and the Sino-Japanese War before that, and the interwar period and all those developments. It would have been nice to have the same kind of depth on the developments in the Second World War, but I totally understand that was not possible within the size constraints of such a book. I mean, look at it. It's already very thick. It's already very big. So if they'd added the same kind of coverage for all the different battles and developments in the Second World War, it would have been a giant book, like some old medieval Bible or something that's worked on for centuries by monks somewhere. So I can absolutely understand that. Maybe they could have done a second book on that, although they say in the foreword, yes, there are works on Imperial Japanese battle histories and so on, so we don't really need to do that. So I don't know. Yes, I guess that's true. So that's only a small negative point. And of course, they do this last chapter in which they talk about what kind of consequences the developments had that they described in the many chapters before. So it's not like they didn't talk about it at all. So that's only a small negative point. The book also doesn't give much information on the Imperial Naval Air Arm, which was quite important to the Imperial Japanese naval thinking before the war and during the war, and that quite strongly influenced how they did what they did and why they thought they could do what they did, what they ended up doing, like occupying large areas and wanting to hold them or trying to hold them and thinking that could work. So it's of course not nice. It's not in the same book, but of course they provided a different one in Sunburst. So that's also only a small negative point. So for things that I thought were positive, there are quite a few nice illustrations in the book, but the book is from 1997, so they are maybe not on a modern standard there. It's a bit, it's a bit old-fashioned in some ways, but nevertheless they are good. They're serviceable. You can understand them. Nice graphs and some nice maps on battles like the Battle of Tsushima, or maybe some chart on how many ships they built in the 1930s as compared to the Americans, and so on. So that's quite nice. And then there's of course a lot of information on the development of tactics, strategy, and material, just like the title suggests, and that is brilliant. It's actually my main positive point about this, which I already mentioned, is that it gives a lot of information on why the Imperial Japanese Navy turned out to be the force that entered the Pacific War in 1941. And that to me is very interesting because I like to understand the broader reasons, the strategy, the thinking, the doctrine behind stuff. So why did they think that the Aikido Butai was still not the main battle force, as stated in the book? That was still the big guns battleships. Why did they wait so long to use Yamato and Musashi? And in the case of Yamato and Musashi as well, didn't really use them at all and threw them away in strange circumstances, really. And all that is covered in this book, and there's a lot of explanations on cultural reasons, constraints on industry, here economic power and money for the naval forces, um, and all this other stuff. And that is very, very interesting, very, very nice. And this information is available in Kaigun. Also, this book gives, and that I think is very positive, um, another perspective. Often we read about the Second World War from a Western perspective. So from a German perspective, a British or an American one. But due to, I guess, language barrier and apparently the wholesale destruction of a lot of documents at the end of the Second World War in Japan, we don't get that much information from the Japanese viewpoint. And so it is very nice to see how they thought and how they developed, how they, what they had in mind, what they were thinking about, how they were seeing things in this book. That gives a very nice perspective on what then happened in the Second World War in the Pacific. Who should be reading this book and who shouldn't? Only in my opinion, of course. I'm not the absolute authority on this. So in my mind, this is a good book, or very good book, for everyone who wants to understand how the Japanese Navy came to be, how it developed, and then how it then became the force that entered the Second World War, as I already said. So essentially, what was their thinking inside the Japanese Navy, and to a lesser degree, the Japanese society, and why was it like that? So if you want to understand reasons for actions, or for actions they took or didn't take, for precautions they did or didn't take, and for the force structure they had, then this is a very good book to read. But I think it's not for a casual reader. So this book goes deep. There are some chapters that go on quite a bit about stuff, but never, although they never go too much into detail because they didn't have the space available for that. But I think you need to be very interested in this topic. You need to want to know why it is to read this book, because it is not a battle history. If you just want to know about operational history for the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, yes, there's stuff on that, but I would guess that there are better books about that. So this is more about the development of stuff in the background, or a bit more in the background. So if you want to know about strategy, tactics, technology in a broader sense, yes. If you want to know about operational history more, especially in the Second World War, then that is maybe not the right book here. Also, as I already said, it's a great book to leave the Western bubble, or the just Western bubble on military history. See their thinking, what they want to think. If you're looking for that, also a good book. As I already said, it's not a history of the Japanese Navy in the Second World War. So if you like to read that or more about that, then I would also recommend some other book. I haven't read one, so sorry, can't tell you anything right now. Also, I think important to recognize that it's not a book that goes deeply into technological details of each and every ship in the Japanese Navy. Yes, there are discussions of key technological features like armament, a bit of a radio and radar, but it's not telling you specifically what can I think the Fubuki had in relation to some other destroyer. So if you want to know more about the actual ship classes, then you would maybe like to go for something like the Osprey series on different ship classes and their developments and technological details. What's my final verdict then on this book? I guess as you can really read out of my quite jubilant description of the content of the book and what I think for whom it is and for whom it isn't, I think this is a very good book. Very good book that helps the Western reader like myself to better understand the culture and the thinking behind the development of the force that then became the force that fought the Second World War in the Pacific and the vast reaches of the Pacific. It therefore provides a lot of answers to questions on how the Japanese did what they did and why they did it and how they came to do it or think they could do it like they did. So in a rather convoluted way, I'm trying to tell you this is a very good book. If you are so inclined, I would very much recommend you to read it. So I now thought it would be beneficial to you, maybe, and an opportunity for me, of course, to show off my book collection, to tell you what I already read on this topic, and maybe, no, not what I already read on this topic, but to tell you about some other books that are in this same kind of category as this book. First of all, of course, as I already mentioned, the chapters that they wanted to do about the naval air arm, the Japanese naval air arm, which was very influential in the conduct of the Second World War in the Pacific, were excluded from Kaigun because of size constraints, and I think we can see that it would have been a giant book if they had included it, and were put in an extra book, Sunburst, by Mark R. Peattie. The Sunburst, the rise of the Japanese naval air power 1909 to 1941. Also very interesting, does a lot of stuff like Kaigun on similar style, and is very interesting and gives a lot of perspective also on why that force fought like it did, why it was structured like it did, and why it ultimately failed also. Another book which is very interesting, to switch again to the American perspective and why the Americans fought the war like they did in the end and how they came to do that, is War Plan Orange, which deals with the US strategy to defeat Japan, or the development of that strategy from 1897 to 1945. This is a book that covers the development of War Plan Orange, which was the American contingency plan for war against Japan over all this time. Is very interesting. Also on if you see the interrelations between what the Japanese thought in Kaigun, what the Americans thought at the same time, and how there was a relationship between that. So I can also recommend this book. If you want to read some more about one of the most influential, or the earliest campaigns in the Second World War in the Pacific, which was the one fought in the South Pacific, so Papua New Guinea, Guadalcanal, and all the other islands on that chain, then I can recommend, or I already read Touch with Fire by Eric Bergrush. I'm sorry, I butchered that name. Also quite a nice book, and goes quite deeply into how that campaign was fought from both sides, and also has quite a few connections to Sunburst, if you know or if you already know about the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy's air service, and it just gives a lot more context to how they did it there. It's also, of course, heavily focused on, or quite heavily focused on the land combat aspect. Also very interesting book. Of course, there are many more interesting books, some that I've read, but I don't want to drag out this video for too long. So now for some final words, whatever YouTuber does at the end of his videos. But I'm not going to ask you to like and subscribe just yet, because it's only my first video. And I just want to tell you what I'm going to do next, because one of the reasons why I want to start this channel, why I want to start doing videos on YouTube, is that I would like to reflect some more on the one or two books that I've read. And sometimes I think, okay, or I've been told that yes, you read those books, but what do you do with the knowledge that you gather there? Do you use this in some way? Do you work with them in your daily life? No, I don't. I work in a normal job, not connected to history. So I thought, okay, if I have those books, why don't I do book reviews on the books I read and then talk about how I think those books are, what I think they do well and they don't do well, but I don't just want to talk about how I think the books are in a technical manner, what kind of information they give, and if you should read them or not. Because my part in this review is, or the benefit for me is, that I want to talk about what are the main points that I learned from that specific book. So, for example, what's the main point I took from Kaigun? But because this video is already quite long, because of the quite extensive content in the book and all the stuff that I wanted to tell you about how it is structured and who should read it and not, I decided to this time, for this quite big book, or quite large book, there's a lot of content, I wanted to do a separate video on that. So in the future, when I did that, or at the point that I did this book, I will upload it and I will put a link to it somewhere here. So if you're interested in my thoughts on what I learned from the book, or what my main points were that I learned from the book, then you can click there and watch that as well if you like. So now I'm at the end of my video. Thank you very much for watching. If anyone came to this point, I would be very happy and very surprised actually. If you liked this video, then please tell me so in the comments. If you didn't, you can also tell me that in the comments, of course. Did you maybe read Kaigun? What do you think about this book? Are there maybe other books that you recommend me to read if I'm interested in the Imperial Japanese Navy, which I am? Is there maybe good battle history that I could read? Or are there maybe good other books that you would recommend me? Yeah, please leave me a comment and tell me about them. And if you think that my video was not good, then please tell me about that. Give me some feedback so I can improve in the future, because I would like to do some more videos on some other books that I've read. Thank you very much again. Have a nice day. Goodbye.